The machine didn't stop when Paul Allen screamed. It kept stamping metal, rhythmic, obedient, indifferent, as Paul clutched his left hand and stared at the blood blooming through his glove like it had made a decision without him. Someone hit the emergency switch. Too late to matter. The damage was already done. Paul sank to his knees anyway. Not from pain. From the thought that came before it. This is going to change everything. The factory floor filled with noise, boots, voices, radios crackling, but Paul heard none of it. He stared at the press like it had betrayed him personally. He'd worked this line for 27 years. Never late. Never careless. Never complained. And still. The paramedic kept asking him questions. Paul answered them automatically. Name. Age. Allergies. He left out the part where his hand had gone numb 5 minutes before the accident. The part where he'd noticed, and kept going. Dependable men don't stop the line. They endure. At home that night, Paul sat on the edge of the bed, his hand wrapped thick in white, throbbing now that the adrenaline had left him alone with it. Monica moved quietly around the room, folding laundry that didn't need folding, touching nothing that mattered. They said it was an accident, she said. Paul nodded. Yeah. The lie felt heavier than the cast. Sean knocked once and peeked in. You gonna be okay, Dad? Paul smiled, the practiced version. I'm fine. Amy hovered behind her brother, eyes sharp, unconvinced. Rambo lay at Paul's feet, head on his boots, unwavering. Paul didn't look at any of them for too long. Later, when the house was asleep, Paul sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, desert silence pressing in from outside. Las Vegas glittered somewhere far away, people winning and losing loudly. Paul had always preferred quiet losses. He flexed his fingers. The numbness returned, subtle and unmistakable. He swallowed. He reached for the pill bottle the doctor had given him, shook one out, then stopped. On the table beside it lay something that hadn't been there earlier. An envelope. No stamp. No return address. Just his name. Paul Allen. His stomach tightened. He opened it. Inside was a single line, typed clean and final. You noticed before it happened. Paul's breath caught. The words weren't a question. They were an accusation. A second sheet slid out. And you chose not to stop. Paul pushed the papers away like they might burn him. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Each second felt counted. Then, from the hallway, came the softest sound. Rambo growled. Low. Warning. Paul stood slowly, heart pounding now, real fear rising where denial had lived for years. Someone was standing outside the kitchen window. A man. Still. Watching. And in that moment, before the knock came, before the man spoke, Paul Allen understood something with terrifying clarity. The accident wasn't the beginning. It was the moment he could no longer pretend he hadn't seen it coming. Paul didn't confront the man at the window. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't wake Monica. He stood there, frozen, watching the reflection of his own face overlay the strangers in the glass, two men occupying the same space without touching. Then the man stepped back. Vanished into the desert dark yard like he'd never been there at all. Rambo stopped growling. That scared Paul more than the growl had. The next morning, the factory called. Not with concern. With procedure. An incident report. A review. Standard protocol, the supervisor said, voice careful in a way that meant cover yourself. Paul answered every question honestly, except the one that mattered. Had he noticed anything unusual before the accident? No, Paul said. The lie tasted metallic. At home, Monica hovered without hovering. She made soup Paul didn't touch. Adjusted his sling twice. Asked about pain, not fear. She'd learned, somewhere along the way, that fear made Paul go quiet. What happens now? She asked gently. Paul shrugged with his good shoulder. Light duty. Maybe. We'll see. Amy watched him from the doorway, arms crossed. Sean sat on the floor with Rambo, pretending not to listen. You should see a specialist, Amy said. Not the company doctor. Paul smiled thinly. I'm fine. She met his eyes. That's not what I asked. He looked away first. That afternoon, the envelope appeared again. This time on the kitchen counter. No sound. No warning. Just there. Paul didn't open it right away. He washed his mug. Dried it. Put it away. Control through ritual. Then, slowly, he unfolded the paper. You've built a life on endurance, it read. That works until it doesn't. Paul's jaw tightened. Another line followed, typed clean and merciless. Tonight. 8 o'clock. The old rail yard. He crumpled the paper, then smoothed it out again. Rambo watched him, head tilted, like he already knew this was a test Paul couldn't avoid. The rail yard smelled like rust and heat even after sunset. Paul parked with the engine running, scanning the shadows. Las Vegas glittered in the distance, false promise, loud confidence. The man from the window stepped into view. Same calm. Same empty hands. You came, the man said. Paul stayed in the truck. You've got 5 minutes. The man nodded. Fair. My name's Jonah, he said. I don't work for the factory. I don't work for the city. I work with men who notice the warning signs and keep going anyway. Paul laughed once. That's a pretty niche job. Jonah didn't smile. It's growing. He gestured toward Paul's bandaged hand. You felt the numbness before the press jammed. Paul clenched his jaw. So what? So you chose productivity over preservation, Jonah said. You always have. Paul opened the door and stepped out, anger flaring hot and sudden. You don't know me. Jonah met his gaze without flinching. I know you stayed late when your son needed help with math. I know you skipped checkups because overtime felt safer than questions. Paul didn't tell Monica about the rail yard. He told himself it was to protect her. The truth was uglier, saying it out loud would make it real. Sleep came in fragments. Every time he drifted, the machine stamped again, metal on metal, over and over, like it was practicing for when he went back. He woke before dawn with his heart racing and his hand numb, pins and needles crawling up his arm like a warning he couldn't shake off anymore. He sat at the kitchen table, lights off, watching the desert sky lighten. Rambo pressed his head against Paul's knee. Grounding. Loyal. Unquestioning. Paul envied the dog. The specialist's office smelled like antiseptic and honesty. The doctor didn't waste time. She turned the screen toward him, images glowing softly in the dim room. This didn't start with the accident, she said. It started years ago. Paul nodded. I know. That surprised her. You do? I just didn't want to hear it. She leaned back. You can keep working for now. But not like before. And not forever. How long? Paul asked. She hesitated. That depends on how much damage you're willing to ignore. The sentence stayed with him. Willing to ignore. Jonah called that afternoon. Paul almost didn't answer. You saw the doctor, Jonah said. Not a question. Paul exhaled sharply. You've got a habit of knowing things. Jonah's voice stayed calm. I've got a habit of listening. They met again, this time at a diner off the highway, neon buzzing weakly overhead. The kind of place where people waited for things to change without knowing what they were waiting for. Jonah slid a napkin across the table. On it, he'd written 3 words. Stop. Shift. Speak. What is this? Paul asked. A sequence, Jonah replied. Most men skip the middle. Paul frowned. Meaning? You're good at stopping when something breaks, Jonah said. You're bad at shifting before it does. And you've never learned how to speak without apologizing for existing. Paul stared at the words. So what, you want me to quit? Jonah shook his head. I want you to stop disappearing. The job is just where that habit shows up. Paul laughed bitterly. That job is my life. Jonah met his eyes. No. It's how you've been earning permission to have one. The words hit with surgical precision. The twist came that night. Paul found Amy in the garage, sitting on an overturned bucket, holding his old lunch pail, the dented metal one he'd carried since she was little. You know, she said without looking up, Sean thinks you're going to be okay. He always does. Paul swallowed. And you? She finally met his eyes. I think you've been afraid longer than you admit. He opened his mouth to deny it. She continued. I overheard Mom on the phone with the insurance company. She was asking about disability options. The world tilted. She didn't want to tell you, Amy said softly. She knows how much you hate feeling replaceable. Paul sat heavily on a crate. I'm not replaceable. Amy nodded. At the factory? You are. At home? You're not. Silence pressed in. That was the lie, exposed at last. Paul had been sacrificing himself for a system that wouldn't notice his absence, while withholding himself from the people who would. Later, alone, he opened the folder Jonah had given him again. This time, he didn't flinch. He saw the pattern clearly now, not just in his nerves, but in his life. How often he'd chosen silence over friction. Endurance over truth. He looked at his bandaged hand. And for the first time, he understood the accident not as punishment. The factory called at noon. Not to check on him. To ask when he was coming back. Paul held the phone in his good hand, staring at the scarred workbench in his garage. The one he'd built himself, measured twice, leveled perfectly. He'd made it sturdy enough to hold weight he never planned to put down. I need more time, he said. A pause. Papers shuffling. A sigh that tried to sound understanding. We can't hold the line forever, the supervisor replied. You know how it is. Paul did know. That was the problem. Monica found him later, sitting on the concrete step behind the house, Nevada heat pressing down like a held breath. Amy told me, she said. Paul didn't ask what. He knew. I should have told you first, he said. Monica sat beside him. Close, but not touching. Giving him space he hadn't earned, and she no longer wanted to pretend he didn't need. I married you because you were strong, she said. But I stayed because you were kind. Somewhere along the way, you decided only one of those counted. Paul swallowed. If I stop working, we'll lose things, Monica said. Yes. He nodded. The house. Security. Everything I promised. She turned to him then. Her eyes were steady. Not pleading. You promised us you, she said. Not the version of you that disappears into overtime. That landed harder than Jonah's words ever had. Jonah came that evening. Didn't knock. Just waited by the fence, letting Paul notice him on his own. You're running out of time, Jonah said. Paul laughed without humor. You say that like it's new. Jonah shook his head. No. You're running out of options. He laid out the truth without padding it. If Paul returned to full duty, the damage would accelerate. If he stopped entirely, the bills would come due faster than disability could cover. If he did nothing, well. Men like you don't collapse dramatically, Jonah said. You fade. And everyone calls it noble. Paul closed his eyes. What do I do? He asked. Not angrily. Not defensively. Honestly. Jonah hesitated. Then spoke carefully. You stop the line. Publicly. Paul's eyes snapped open. You want me to make a scene? I want you to tell the truth where it matters most, Jonah replied. Not just to your family. To the place that taught you silence was loyalty. The idea made Paul's chest tighten. He imagined the looks. The whispers. The quiet judgment. "Why?" he asked. Jonah's voice softened. "Because if you don't name it, someone else will bury it. And you'll keep paying the price alone." The collapse came faster than Paul expected. The numbness spread up his arm 2 days later while he was tying his shoes. Simple task. Automatic. Until it wasn't. He sat there, laces half done, heart racing, the truth undeniable now. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a deadline. That afternoon, Paul drove to the factory. Not to work. To stop it. The floor manager frowned when Paul stepped onto the line unannounced, sling visible, face pale but resolved. "What are you doing?" she asked. Paul took a breath. Felt every eye turn toward him. "I need the line shut down," he said. 5 minutes. She laughed nervously. "We don't do that." Paul reached out with his good hand and slapped the emergency stop. The machine screamed. Metal froze mid-motion. Silence crashed down, heavy and absolute. Everyone stared. Paul's heart pounded. Fear roared. But beneath it, relief. He turned to the room. To the men and women who'd stood beside him for years. "I felt it before the accident," he said, voice shaking but loud enough. "I kept going anyway. Because I thought stopping meant failing." Security escorted Paul out without drama. That surprised him. No shouting. No handcuffs. Just a quiet walk past faces he'd known for decades, some confused, some angry, some strangely relieved. One man nodded at him. Small. Almost imperceptible. Paul held onto that like a rope. Outside, the desert heat hit him full in the chest. He breathed anyway. The consequences came fast. Termination paperwork. Insurance gaps. Numbers that didn't add up no matter how patiently Monica rearranged them on the kitchen table. Paul signed where he was told to sign. For once, he didn't pretend the pen felt normal in his hand. "I'm scared," Monica said one night, voice barely above the hum of the fridge. Paul nodded. "Me too." That was new. That was everything. The unexpected call came 3 weeks later. Not from the factory. From the union. They'd heard about the shutdown. About the speech. About the injury Paul hadn't hidden. "We need someone," the voice said, "who knows the line from the inside. Someone workers will listen to." Paul laughed softly. "My hands aren't what they used to be." "That's the point," the voice replied. Paul didn't become rich. He didn't become famous. He sat in small rooms with tired people and told the truth out loud. About bodies that whisper before they break. About loyalty that shouldn't cost you your name. About stopping before damage becomes permanent. The tremor stayed. So did the numbness. But something else stayed too. His son started calling more. Amy asked questions, not worried ones, curious ones. Monica slept easier, even when the numbers were tight. Rambo followed Paul everywhere, certain this version of his human was finally home. One evening, Paul sat alone in the garage. The workbench was still there. Solid. Honest. He ran his good hand across its surface and felt the grooves he'd carved into it years ago without realizing he was leaving a record. He reached into a drawer and pulled out the factory badge he'd kept. Then he did something that would have terrified him once. He set it down. Didn't hide it. Didn't throw it away. Just let it be part of the past. Later, lying in bed, Paul felt the familiar numbness creep in again. He didn't panic. He didn't curse it. He placed his hand on Monica's arm and breathed. Because the machine that once defined him no longer ran his life. Because he had stopped the line. Not just in the factory. But inside himself. And in the quiet that followed, Paul Allen finally understood the faith he'd been practicing without knowing it. That a man is not measured by how much he can endure in silence. But by the moment he chooses to stand still, speak clearly, and let the world adjust around the truth. Outside, Las Vegas burned bright and loud. Inside the house, the night was calm. And for the first time since the accident, nothing in Paul Allen was still moving against his will.